Hi, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar focused on the changing role of continuing ed divisions in a 60-year curriculum environment. My name is Amrit Ahluwalia. I'm the managing editor of EvoLLution, and for those of you who are new to our publication, EvoLLution is an online newspaper focused on non-traditional higher education. We publish articles and interviews by leaders across the post-secondary space, sharing their insights into how higher education itself is changing and how colleges and universities are adapting to keep pace. During today's discussion, we're going to cover 5 topics to help provide an overview of the direction we believe higher education to be moving. We'll start off by providing some context around the similarities and differences between the Canadian and American higher education markets. The 60-year curriculum, after all, is a concept developed chiefly by leaders of American universities, and I want to ensure we're properly contextualizing the information. We'll then reflect on some of the obstacles to the sustainability of higher education status quo, and then discuss the characteristics of student centricity and what makes a college or university truly student-centric. I'll then briefly discuss the 60-year curriculum concept, and at that point we'll turn to our panel. We're fortunate today to be joined by 3 panelists who are going to help us close the webinar by contextualizing and discussing the work CE leaders can do to help deliver a modern lifelong learning environment to Canadian colleges and universities. The panelists are Carolyn Young, the Director of Continuing Studies at Western University in London, Ontario, Christine Brooks-Cappadocia, Director of Continuing and Professional Education at York University in Toronto, and Robert Wensveen, the Associate Director of Continuing Education at the University of Calgary. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the chat function to send them to us. We'll try to leave time for questions at the end, but if we run to the end of the hour, I'll be sure to follow up with you individually. So to place our discussion in context, I want to frame that I'm going to be sharing ideas and quotes from our American authors today. So to start off our discussion, I want to set the stage for why I think their insights are particularly useful for Canadian audience. As far as similarities go, I think it's important we focus in on the impact of automation on the labor market. To start that conversation, it's worth looking at Moore's Law, which is the idea that the processing power of computers doubles every 18 months to 2 years. This fundamentally is what's driving the automation of tasks, and in some cases jobs, and what's driving the need for constant reskilling and upskilling. As more of people's time is freed up from doing manual or repeatable tasks, there's greater expectation from employers for them to conduct high-value work. It's the role of upskilling and reskilling programming to help individuals keep pace with those changing expectations. Additionally, there's a distinct need to create access to retraining programs for individuals who are going to be structurally unemployed by rapidly changing technologies, and to create pathways to more sustainable careers. When we look at the impact of automation, both in the United States and Canada, McKinsey provides us the statistics for the United States, and a paper from the Advisory Council on Economic Growth provides us the Canadian context. We're really looking at very, very similar experiences when it comes to the number of people whose jobs and ultimately potentially careers are going to be impacted by advancing technology. Now, among admittedly numerous differences between the Canadian and American post-secondary environments, the one I think is most relevant to our discussion today is completion and attainment rates. In the US, in order to support the continued growth of the economy and adapt to the impact of automation, the Lumina Foundation has set a goal of 60% attainment rate by 2025. The attainment rate goes beyond the completion rate. Completion rate looks at degree completion, or completion of accredited programs. The attainment rate expands that look to look at sort of non-degree credentials as well. So high quality certificates and certifications are also included in the attainment rate. As you can see, not only are they well below the goal they've set to achieve in the next 5 years, they're not on track to meet it in the US. In Canada, we have an extremely high attainment and completion rate. In fact, Canada has the highest proportion of college graduates among all OECD countries at 22.4%. Additionally, 10.8% of Canadians have an apprenticeship or trade certificate, which would be considered a high-quality credential by Lumina. Therefore, the focus of American universities and colleges has to be on conferring high-quality credentials. We're talking accredited degrees and industry-recognized certificates and certifications that help people access entry-level jobs and gain basic employment skills. When we look at it through that lens, the focus of American colleges and universities is on the attainment of credentials that create pathways to middle-skill jobs. Given that high Canadian attainment rate, The focus of colleges and universities here has to be on upskilling and reskilling when it comes to serving non-traditional audiences. This requires just-in-time programming designed to help people adapt to changing employment needs. As a second observation, the high attainment rate actually presents an exciting opportunity for Canadian universities to focus on prior learning assessment and stacking that can help drive the bachelor degree completion rate higher. But that's a different conversation for a different day. Fundamentally, these sort of, I guess, pairing trends lead us to understand that the traditional higher education market is becoming unsustainable. Colleges and universities in Canada need to evolve to serve more than just the traditional post-secondary market. And I think at this point, it's worth taking a pause because it's a critique that comes up often when we talk about innovative program models. There will always be a market for traditional start of career education programming. The purpose of this conversation today, and to contextualize, the purpose of every conversation on this topic is not to suggest getting rid of what we already have in place, but people are living longer, they're working longer careers, and as we discussed earlier, the demands of jobs continues to grow. Fundamentally, people are no longer living three-stage lives. Lives are increasingly multi-stage and complex, requiring more diverse education engagements that meet them at various points along their life cycle. Canadian post-secondary institutions obviously do a great job of helping individuals get the credentials they need at the start of their careers, and that's very, very clear through our attainment rate. This means, though, that Canadian continuing ed divisions have a unique competitive challenge that's, not shared by colleagues south of the border. American continuing ed divisions stand out as an ideal option for prospective learners because they're a pathway to a critical credential that serves as the pathway to middle skill work. For Canadian universities and colleges to compete, there's a lot more providers that can actually serve the audiences they're set up to serve. And this fundamentally comes to the fact that learners are looking, more for on-demand outcomes, programs that help them meet a specific career need. They're not necessarily focused on the credential that comes from any given offering. They're focused on whether it meets their specific expectations. In short, Canadian students have a lot more choice at their disposal. And what that means is that it's essential to start rethinking customer service in the post-secondary context. When we start talking about non-traditional students, they're looking for those concrete outcomes that are going to support career progression. They also have limited time at their disposal to invest in higher education. That makes it the responsibility of institutions who serve learners to ensure they can focus as much of their limited time as possible on learning, not on bureaucracy. The point Heather's making here introduces us to the importance of conscious design to achieve student centricity. Recognizing students as customers is a first step, but fundamentally the hard work is going to come from delivering an environment that treats them that way. To deliver on that vision, post-secondary institutions need to closely examine their processes and their infrastructure to ensure they're actually student-centric. Student centricity really has to evolve beyond a buzzword and instead kind of serve as a philosophy to serving modern learners. It really is a never-ending pursuit. It requires every single aspect of the institution, from program design to the ad drop process to the copy on the website, to be angled and designed specifically to serve the learners coming through the doors. Fundamentally, that's where Mark is coming from here. Institutional processes have iterated, but they haven't evolved. We've found ways to make the status quo a lot faster and a lot easier, especially on ground level staff, but we haven't really explored any alternatives to the status quo. From the Canadian perspective, that's frankly why alternative providers are already making headway. We're seeing robust competition for students looking for upskilling and reskilling opportunities from the non-institutional sector. In this quote, Hunt points out a few significant entrants into the market. We also have to be aware, frankly, of MOOC providers, of boot camps like Lighthouse Labs, of lynda.com, and other organizations that offer non-degree programming. Fundamentally, the institutional brand only carries so much weight. It's going to get individuals to look at your offerings, but their decision to register will frankly come down to how well aligned a program and an institution is with that particular individual student's needs and expectations. So let's talk student centricity. First and foremost, a student-centric institution recognizes the fundamental changes in modern learners' characteristics. Now, I love this chart. Anyone who knows me has seen me show this chart. I love this chart. I could honestly talk about it all day, but we don't have all day. And I want to highlight sort of 3 specific aspects for today's discussion to help us, again, contextualize our topic and to help us really wrap our heads around what we're doing. To start off, I want to point our attention to push education versus just-in-time learning. Now, most institutions set up their curriculum on the basis of push education, which is the idea that, faculty, for the most part, are going to teach the topics they're comfortable about in the areas they're comfortable about, and frankly, the subtopics within the topics that they're comfortable about. And while that's great as a kickoff point, it's great to help individuals become comfortable with the topic, to engage with their faculty member. It's not responsive necessarily to what the market is looking for. And what that leads to is a mismatch between what an institution is offering, what an institution is focusing its resources on, and what learners are actually trying to accomplish, which is just-in-time learning. Again, when we've talked about the needs of non-traditional students, they're looking for very specific learning engagements at very specific times that are going to help them achieve a very specific outcome. To that end, we also need to pay attention to the idea of degrees versus outcomes. When we're talking about the Canadian context, again, our attainment rate is extremely high. So the promise of a credential is not necessarily going to be a differentiator for a learner who's looking for a specific piece of learning engagement. What they're looking for is how well is that learning engagement going to match up with what they're looking to accomplish out of an education? What are they trying to achieve, and how is the institution helping them get there? The outcome becomes significantly more important than the piece of paper. And that brings us to the third topic that I want to talk about on this list, which is universal outcome acceptance versus single institution credit recognition. Now, a degree can hold a lot of weight in any given institution, and the transcript helps to describe what it is that an individual did over that course of time and provide some kind of benchmarking as to how they performed. But once you step outside the institution, those artifacts don't hold the same amount of value, certainly, and in some cases don't hold significant value. If you try to show a transcript to an employer, beyond being able to get a feel for the marks, they're not really going to understand what the courses were that the student took, how they translate to what the employer is actually looking for. There's a mismatch between what an institution is trying to communicate and what an employer or even an individual learner is able to understand. Universal outcome acceptance takes us outside that very institution-centric way of looking at student performance and recognizes that there's more to an education experience than necessarily even what a student learned. There's the capacity to communicate that learning to the student and then to anyone who might be interested. That's where universal outcome acceptance starts to become really important as we rethink kind of what the institution is and what role it serves. We have to rethink how we're communicating learning outcomes. Being truly student-centric also requires post-secondary institutions to understand their true value proposition for learners. Colleges and universities can no longer differentiate themselves as exclusive gatekeepers of knowledge because, frankly, information is everywhere. Each leader has to ask themselves, who are our students? Why did they decide to enroll? And are we meeting their needs and expectations? We're comfortable with the pedagogical reasoning behind moving from the sage on the stage model to a guide on the side model in the learning environment, but we really need to take that thinking beyond the classroom. To that end, we have to rethink and, to some extent, the role of the institution itself. According to Hunt Lambert, again, we spoke about him earlier, he is one of the most vocal supporters of the 60-year curriculum concept. Hunt Lambert says that individual institutions are unlikely to supply more than 20% of any learner's solutions from their faculty-based degree programs. That's a pretty incredible shift from what we think of as being the traditional role of the post-secondary institution as a deliverer of information. Colleges and universities, according to Lambert, need to start positioning themselves more as supporters of students' lifelong learning journeys, as the conduit, not the endpoint in and of itself. And that philosophical shift is very much central to the 60-year curriculum. Now, the 60-year curriculum concept requires us to consciously engage with learners contextually over the course of their 100-year-plus life. It requires us to rethink some of the fundamental building blocks of post-secondary programming, which include, as Jeff Russell points out here, course design and customization, flexibility and personalization, and even credentialing. When we start thinking about these aspects of what what an institution is, what an institution does, how a university or a college delivers on the expectations of the individuals coming in the door, I think of a model that really helps to illustrate the potential for learning across a lifetime, which is the spectrum of access. Now, this visual really helps to illustrate the various points along which individuals will aim to access post-secondary programming. As you go further right, the investment of time and money increases. This model can help start the discussion around unbundling of programs and knowledge to make colleges and universities more accessible to more people. Right now, the majority of institutional knowledge and focus lives in the credit-based area on the far right, also meaning that the investment of time and energy and money is at the highest. But we really have to start asking ourselves, what if closed degree programs could be unbundled and expanded? How could these offerings be redesigned and repackaged? How could modularized content be shared to more audiences? How could modularized content be integrated into custom lifelong learning pathways? And almost equally importantly, as understanding the programming itself, what would it take to promote the right offerings to the right people at the right time? Now, again, I want to reiterate, it's worth bearing in mind that this unbundling process does not and should not suggest doing away with a traditional post-secondary experience. There is always going to be a market of individuals looking for a formative post-secondary experience. What we're looking at here is how to make more content and learning opportunities available to more people across more stages of their life. How do we leverage what already exists to serve audiences who aren't being served by the institution? And when we're talking about Canada, we are talking about, to a certain extent, a public service. How do we ensure that the public gets what they need out of their college, their university? It's a question well worth asking. And I think as we start diving into sort of the 60-year curriculum, we can really start contextualizing and understanding our evolved role. Now, according to the pioneers of the 60-year curriculum movement, continuing ed leaders can play a significant role in driving the vision forward. Hunt Lambert and Rovi Brannon highlight 5 things CE leaders can do to advance this new vision of the institution and its role. First, there's defining the meta-curricular framework. We have to be able to serve customers on their own terms. We have to advocate for diverse funding streams. We have to diversify credentialing, and we have to build a new academic tech stack. As we continue through this webinar, we're going to address each of these 5 elements in turn. I'm going to briefly introduce the idea, and then our panelists are going to help contextualize and ground each of the 5 steps as we go. At this stage, I would like to sincerely thank our panelists, Carolyn Young, Robert Wensfien, and Christine, for taking the time out to be part of this discussion and for helping us to contextualize these ideas. We're just getting ourselves finally set up here, and just unmute everyone. Hi, panelists.
Hello. Hi, Amrit.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. So as I mentioned, we're going to go through the 5 steps, and then we're going to throw it to you for insights and context. So we'll start off with the first concept, which is defining the meta-curricular framework. Now, if we accept that learners need to access education over the course of their lifetimes, rather than in a specific period of time in a specific program, then we have to think outside the bounds of a formal curriculum to a more variable and learner-driven set of learning activities. In this way, delivering a true 60-year curriculum requires institutions to build meta-curricular frameworks that help organize learning activities through a variety of complex life stages, rather than over the span of a single program designated and designed for unrealistic 3-stage life. Turning to our panelists, Carolyn, Christine, and Robert. Now, how have you worked with faculty across the institution to create access to their course content for non-credit, non-traditional students? Christine, why don't we start with you?
Okay, well, that's not within our organization's, our school's mandate, but we do drive students. So we don't actually deliver faculty courses. We own our own curriculum at the School of Continuing Studies, which we develop and deliver ourselves. But our mandate is to drive students both as a pathway from into degree studies and then provide a finishing year or post-degree credentials to students after they've completed their degree.
Absolutely. Robert, would you like to build on that?
Can you hear me?
I can.
So continuing education at the University of Calgary is completely non-credit. And every faculty at the University of Calgary does credit as well as non-credit in professional development. On the non-credit side, we are the largest. And so what we offer is our expertise, our knowledge, our infrastructure, in order to facilitate and help those units and those faculties to better deliver their non-credit. Many of them today do not have systems in place, do not have the marketing capability in place, but they're trying to do something in this space because they see the value of providing professional development. So we're providing our knowledge, our expertise in this field in order to help them achieve those goals.
Absolutely. So to clarify, the role of the continuing ed division at Calgary as it currently stands is to deliver kind of a level of expertise in serving non-traditional audiences so that the faculties can own and focus on delivering high quality programming. But when it comes to delivering the student experience that non-traditional learners expect, that's where continuing ed plays a significant role.
Yes, that's correct.
Absolutely. And Carolyn, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, so Amrit, sorry, I lost contact for a few minutes, but thank you for including me in this discussion. And we at Western University, we have some very progressive strategies around being connected with the institution. So for example, for many years, we've been able to offer non-credit registration to anyone who is not a current student at Western. And so there's always been good uptake on that one, and it's been a successful partnership. More recently, we've developed some partnerships with faculties, education, engineering, and health sciences to be exact, where we have been able to offer courses to career professionals. And we're really pleased with the direction that this is taking. So at Western University, I feel that there's a real interest in meeting the needs of diverse students. I tend to use diverse rather than non-traditional in my speeches on continuing ed. And we just see that with all the focus that's been happening, articles like the 60-year curriculum and the reports that are coming out of the provincial and federal government, that this is a really important time for continuing ed to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, the theme that each of you have touched on here relates back to the idea of forging very strong partnerships with partners on main campus. So again, starting with Christine and moving down the line, what does it take to build stronger partnerships between continuing ed divisions and main campus faculties?
Certainly some frankness and some honesty. Tended to come from, we're in a very centralized CE unit, and we're fairly new, we're less than 5 years old. So we're going into an institution that's fairly well established. It's been around for 50 years and saying, hey, we're going to change things and do things differently within our unit. We're going to do non-degree studies. And we're going to do it differently than they've traditionally done it. So we spend a lot of time talking about how what we do enhances the great stuff that our faculty members are doing, right? There are fantastic programs at York. York is a leader in the liberal arts and humanities programs, and there's a real need for those things. Those kinds of programs have felt under attack for the last few years as people have valued STEM education. And so for a lot of the conversations, I start with explaining our role as continuing studies and helping students who may have excellent backgrounds in liberal arts and the humanities to help them translate what they do. Those skill sets will be very useful when they go to develop management roles, but helping them translate those critical thinking skills into something that a frontline manager, hiring manager will recognize. So it's about degree enhancement more than an alternative to a degree for us.
Absolutely. Robert?
Within our institution, it's been both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. our provost has struggled for a number of years in terms of trying to get a handle and an understanding on what non-credit activity is taking place in the institution. Within continuing education ourselves, we've been on a system where we can easily report that, but the other departments and faculties have either not been on a system at all, meaning they're doing it through spreadsheets or other means, or they've had different systems. So trying to get a holistic view on what activity is taking place on this campus has been a challenge for our provost. And so we're implementing our system for these other units in the hopes that they all come on board, which they are. That has been very helpful, but it's been top down and bottom up. Top down with some incentives from the provost to do that, and bottom up in terms of us showing the value add that we can provide when we have all of these structures in place.
Absolutely. And Carolyn?
Yeah, so I can agree with Christine and Robert's points of view on how to build stronger partnerships. In the 9 years that I've been the director at Western Continuing Studies, there's been a lot of growing interest in what we do, and I would say that it takes persistence of the CE leader to create that dialogue, especially for our colleagues on main campus to understand that the continuum of learning is a much longer and significant change over a person's lifetime. The end goal is to be heard and to gain the influence of a senior leader who has the same vision. I also believe that conveying the flexibility that Western Continuing Studies or that any continuing education unit has around being able to test programs is really important for our colleagues on campus to hear. And with our team, I feel that we've been very resourceful in using all of the opportunities that are available, particularly when you are connected with a national association like the Canadian Association of University Continuing Education. You can draw from the best practices and the lessons that your colleagues have learned across Canada to learn about what are the best practices and partnerships and to be successful at those initiatives.
Absolutely.
Amrit, I can't stress what Carolyn has said, agree with what Carolyn has said enough. Being able to draw on best practices helps us make the case that we need to follow those best practices and add in how we add value back to our institution. We're seen as part of our university's accessibility mandate, and being able to say, you know, Carolyn down the 401 is doing something very similar to us and they've tried it is very, very helpful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we'll turn our attention now as a group to the second step, which is, you know, serving customers on their own terms. And Lambert and Brannon point out that it's absolutely essential for post-secondary institutions to implement services designed to serve customers over the course of a lifetime. We can't keep making post-secondary customers jump through hoops to get to their intended outcomes. They fundamentally need to be able to focus as much of their available time as possible on their academic endeavors. In effect, the 60-year curriculum demands a very different understanding of the student-learner life cycle. It demands a different understanding of what it takes to retain a learner and what retention actually means. And fundamentally, it starts to shift the institutional role in supporting learners. This includes rethinking, again, retention services, career services, and enrollment services to keep pace and help connect the array of programming available to a particular learner's life stage, career progression, and needs. So, returning back here to our panelists, how can collaborations be built between continuing ed and not necessarily the academic part of the campus, but with divisions like career services and student services to deliver a more tailored experience to non-credit learners? And Robert, I'd love to start with you here.
Well, I believe that a big part of it is empowering the learners so that they can manage, you know, and control their learning journeys throughout their time. We at the University of Calgary have used the term cradle to grave because we have everything from kids camps courses and programs that are for people who are planning retirement or in retirement. But I think critically, and the authors also mention, and they make reference to a CRM type of a system that needs to be put in place so that either the institution and or the learners can manage their paths. Because people have life-changing experiences throughout the course of their lives, and their plans and their progressions might change as well at the same time. So I think that we need to establish a way for the learners to manage and control their journey and have an ability to look back and alter their journey and have some advice and some guidance along the way when those changes take place. It's more about, it's not just about a transcript. It's not just about being able to access a record of your academic activity from when you were a kid to now that you're a retiree. It's also about capturing your knowledge, your experience, your interests, and your other professional development along the way. So I would suggest that whether it's an e-portfolio kind of a structure or some sort of an enhanced CRM, as the authors are referring to, it's about empowering the learners. That's my point.
Absolutely. Christine, would you like to follow up?
Sure. We've actually, like many continuing education units, we have focused our communications with our students and our relationship with our students based on a CRM model. However, in the last year, we've taken a bit of a different tact. We offer our programs on campus and many of them to full-time international students. So we've actually been trying to develop closer relationships with our traditional university students for that population. So it's different than our mid-career population in that these students want things like access to the library, access to the gym, the discount on Go bus passes. So we've actually integrated our CRM and our own registration system in with the university's main system, so their students now get student numbers. So if you're an international student, so it starts with where the customer is. If you're an international student, you might need career center services, or you might need to access the York International. And so we facilitate that. If you're a mid-career professional who's only here on the weekends, you might want access to the library or access to a computer lab. And again, we structure those services based on what you need. We've actually developed different kinds of career supports for them than they would traditionally get through a university career center, because the focus of the audience's needs are different, right? If you're mid-career, you don't necessarily need to know how to go out and launch a career. You need to know how to transition a career.
Carolyn?
So at Western, we have a couple of really unique ways that we collaborate with Career Services and the Student Services Division to deliver a positive experience for our students. That includes our collaboration with Student Services for the students who are in our diploma programs and the French Immersion School. So they support us in ensuring that they are admitted to Western and that their courses are on Western's transcripts. And so in terms of technology, we have two separate systems, but they are speaking to each other in order to make sure that that specific outcome is met for the students. The web services team in Student Services has been a particularly valuable partner for us to improve the registration process for all of our students. So that includes the non-credit students in professional development and Western employees. In Career Services, we have collaborated and continue to collaborate on the work integrated learning programs that we offer through our diploma programs. And we also use our relationship with that department for outreach to employers in the community, either for open enrollment programs or for placements with the employers in the community.
Absolutely. One thing that struck me about all of your responses is that you're almost framing the delivery of a customer experience around the idea of facilitating self-service and personalization, basically ensuring that students are able to engage with the institution as and when they see fit in a way that kind of makes sense to their specific context, the reason they're enrolling, and the availability and time that they have at their disposal. It's interesting to consider the importance of that level of personalization and self-service when it comes to contextual student supports. And then when you pair that with the work you're doing with, you know, some of the more traditional offices on campus designed to serve the learner progress, it makes for a very robust experience. Now, continuing our pathway down these 5 steps, we're turning our attention here to the importance of CE leaders playing a front and center role in advocating for more corporate and government support for non-credit higher education. Essentially, greater federal, provincial, and employer funding needs to be made available to support learner access to ongoing education over the 100-year life. In this way, according to, again, Brannon and Lambert, it's essential for CE leaders to become a force in and of themselves when it comes to lobbying for greater financial resources for non-traditional learners enrolling in non-credit programs, especially as these increasingly become the norm. So to turn our attention again back to our panelists, and Carolyn, I know this is a topic you're extremely passionate about, so I'd love for you to start us off. What should CE leaders do to move federal and provincial government bodies on financial support for lifelong learning?
So Amrit, you're right. I am very excited about this question. So thank you for letting me go first. This is actually part of a leadership role in continuing education that I find extremely fulfilling because it is impactful. It not only is going to make a difference in the here and now, but it can have a legacy for your department, for your community, and when you think about it in a really high level way for your country. So one of the ways that I think you can make a real difference is joining forces with other schools across Canada or in your province. CE leaders can be most effective in communicating the scope of what we do, the impact that we have in our communities, and the capacity to support lifelong learning. So Western University, just like York and Calgary, is a very active member in the Canadian Association of University Continuing Education. We are also very active in our provincial network, which is called the Ontario Council of University Lifelong Learning. And there are so many opportunities for us to connect and be successful together in obtaining funding. So a recent example is the Future Skills Center. They made a call for proposals in August. The proposals were due on September 16th. And I'm very excited about the way that KUSE, the National Association, has been responding to this opportunity. One of the really practical things that we all need to do is make sure that our impact is understood by conveying the numbers. And so data about our learners is in high demand. Some of us have really great systems for getting those reports and knowing what we're doing. And I would say that that's still a work in progress for the National Association and for individual members. Thank you for letting me go first.
Christine and Robert, anything to add?
Just pointing out the great work that KUSE has done in advocating with Universities Canada. Having our often requests and government inquiries about potential funding sources starts in our president's and provost's office. So the work that KUSE has done to make sure that our sector is known within Universities Canada has been very helpful.
And I would add that provincially, you know, the provincial government here in Alberta, they want to see collaboration, as Carolyn had suggested, amongst the institutions. If they're providing funding and additional bursaries for students to take programs of study, they want to ensure that these programs of study are not being replicated everywhere else, because students can take these courses online, they can take them in a variety of different formats. So the government wants some assurance that they're not providing incentives to students for a multitude of repeatable courses and programs. And I think that if we show that collaboration, that gains their interest, and that makes them, part of the solution.
Absolutely. And continuing on the idea, we've talked about what CE leaders can do to drive additional funding from government sources. Let's turn our attention to employers, which are an incredibly important part of this discussion as well. What are some triggers that could push employers to think and act more seriously when it comes to actively financially encouraging ongoing education?
I think programs like the Job Skills program within Canada, for example, is a great program to promote, where employers can be partially funded or providing professional development and skills retraining for their own employees. And I think taking advantage of those existing programs and promoting them to employers and to the public so that employees are aware of this as well is one way to do that.
Robert, this is Amrit. This is Carolyn. I would say, I agree with Robert's point of view, and I would also say when you take it to individual employers, it's their own experiences in learning. There are so many people who are leading companies, they are in decision-making roles, and they themselves have benefited from continuous learning in their own careers. So sometimes that is a way to help with that understanding. I think on a more negative side is that when they discover that there is a lack of skills in their current team, they're not keeping pace with the changes in technology, that also drives employers to pay more attention to learning and development in their organization. And then another place that could really raise that challenge is when they've got a lack of applicants for postings in specific roles.
Exactly. We've also taken it as a step further and taken the ability to offer block seat discounts outside of our corporate training arm. So while our corporate training people can offer block seats, everybody who answers the phone or talks to a person, any employer in our organization, knows what the block discount is for seats, because sometimes it's just a matter of a 5% discount will make the difference between an employer having that conversation with a group of employees or not. Often, even though there's good, I'm always shocked at the number of employees who don't take advantage of their employer's tuition assistance, and they're reluctant to. So changing that conversation and having the employer suggest it can change the fear in potential individual students in asking to be funded.
It's always fascinating to kind of think about the capacity for continuing ed to serve almost as a strategic support for employers and for industry. And as our panelists have pointed out, that the importance of being able to fund it, to functionally and deliver customized service to employers, and then follow through on that with discounting is a significant piece of that. Now, fourth, and something we touched on a little bit earlier today, is the role that CE leaders are expected to play in diversifying the credentials available to learners. Now, undergraduate and graduate degrees, and frankly, more traditional certificates, have been higher education's bread and butter, but the growth of alternative providers suggests that these offerings alone aren't enough to meet the needs of a changing market. It's critical to begin developing new nomenclature and markers of learning completion to help break down the traditional bounds of formal learning and create more opportunities for ongoing lifelong learning and development. According to Brandon and Lambert, this can be accomplished by purposefully finding ways to unbundle and repackage currently closed degree programs into certificates, courses, and modules that learners can take when time and resources allow, which is fundamentally what we talked about with the spectrum of access. So coming back to our panel, what are some of the common objections you hear around the potential for badges and certificates from main campus colleagues? And Christine, I'd love for you to start off.
Well, certainly in certificates, there's a fear of eroding the quality of the institutional brand. So we've gone to great lengths to make sure that we have not only a well-established quality framework, but that it's been approved by both Provost and Senate and has a seal of approval on it. to take some of that fear out of offering a non-credit certificate.
Absolutely. Carolyn?
Yeah, so fortunately at Western, a number of our colleagues value certificates, and many are incorporated into the undergraduate degrees. But as an alternative example, something more recent, we are now in a partnership with the Faculty of Education to incorporate a professional certificate in project management along with a master's degree in international school leadership. And we're very pleased with the way that we've been able to combine a non-credit certificate with a graduate degree. There is interest in badges. So I've been in many conversations over the last 2 years around badges, but I think the common objection I hear, and I understand this, is that there are actually few employers in our region who are expressing a demand for that. And so I think badges, that terminology itself, is still not widely understood, and it may be something that we need to do work on. And so when we've had meetings on badges, we're always talking about how we need to go to the employers and make sure that this is something that they understand and are looking for.
And Robert?
So similar to what Carolyn has said, there has been some movement on short certificates, stackable certificates, postgraduate certificates, and similarly as well within our Faculty of Education. So you can take a number of certificates which can be laddered or stacked towards a master's certificate or a master's degree even. And so we're working with that structure, and within the University of Calgary, we've actually developed the non-credit credentials framework. And really what this framework is supposed to address or addresses is approval levels. So whether the approval level is at the unit or the faculty or through a general faculty's council, if it needs to be, what the duration of learning is. So is it like a short learning series, or is it a longer program of study? Is it assessed or unassessed learning? And what are the admission requirements, for example? So this non-credit credentials framework is institutional, and it's to set the standard for what these types of shorter term certificates or parchments and the ability to obtain them, the ability to participate in those programs. Badging has not really come to the forefront, although experiential learning and competency-based learning has. So I'm just not sure that we've really come to terms on how we want to represent that learning, whether it's through badges or it continues to be through short certificates.
So we have at York, we are actually experimenting with badging right now, and the common questions about it are, how do you ensure that somebody doesn't make up their own badge? And the other questions that seem to come to us are around, what does a badge mean? What level of credential? So much like the work that Robert's institution has done for establishing a framework, I think we need to come to some common understanding, either nationally or worst case within our institutions, to say a badge is awarded for this sort of level of learning or is assessed this way, so that employers know what it means.
Absolutely. It's an interesting point that our panel raises about badges. It's something that I'd actually like to address before we move on, because it's a topic that tends to come up a lot across the evolution community. What is a badge? What's it for? Where does it sit? Now, badges are a unique kind of center of a Venn diagram that brings together a trend of digital credentialing and micro-credentialing. Micro-credential can be anything sub-degree, really. So a certificate is a form of a micro-credential, for example. A certification is a form of a micro-credential, for example. And a badge is fundamentally, it's a digital credential that's providing insights into a micro-credential. The digital credentialing trend is largely driven by the capacity to increase the visibility of different skills and competencies in a slightly different framework. So rather than having a piece of paper, it's an artifact that lives in a digital format, whether it's on your LinkedIn or in an email signature. So I think there's a certain extent to which authors across the evolution community, when they talk about badges or digital credentials, start to gain that little bit more sort of trust in the credential with the recognition that through, for example, through providers like Credly, you have the capacity to formalize a badge with branding, with rich text that provides kind of deeper insights into what the credential signifies once an individual earns it. Digital credentials it's a fascinating space, but as our panelists have rightly pointed out, I think we all as an industry need to be careful about the use of the word badges, because I think folks start thinking about the Boy Scouts and things like that when we start getting into that conversation. So to close us off with our fifth step, the last step Brandon and Lambert advocate for is the development of a new academic tech stack designed around the needs of customers rather than the existing institutional framework. Fundamentally, to a certain extent, this is the culmination of everything we've been talking about up to this point. A lifelong learning model, as kind of framed by the 60-year curriculum, cannot exist without an evolved tech stack that's designed to serve students over the course of decades rather than months or years. We need evolved approaches to track and support things like lifelong student enrollment and progress, credential completion, as I mentioned, with the advent and expansion potentially of digital credentials. Long-term customer relationships need the capacity to visualize and analyze data in real time. We need the capacity to facilitate mobile access. And we also need the capacity to start integrating technologies that at the moment are new and might not have even emerged yet. We need to find ways to bring AI into part of the operation of the institution. We need to be able to facilitate new program delivery methods as and when they arise. So back to our panelists to close us out. How can technology be leveraged to help continuing education divisions move past the bounds of the institutional status quo? And Carolyn, we can start off with you here.
So my answer is threefold, and it's just a very, I'm going to say, practical point of view, not necessarily visionary. But what I would say the priority is around providing access to learners. And so you simply need to have a system from the start that is timely, efficient, and flexible, not to mention convenient. That in itself is a big breakthrough. And at Western University, we made a change several years ago that helped students immensely with not only being able to register, but to do self-serving, to do a self-serve functionality around getting their transcripts and seeing where they were progressing in terms of a certificate. You need a system that is geared for diverse learners. So at Western University, we are supporting students in professional development, in diploma programs, and in French immersion. And once they have set up their profile in the system, they can go back whenever they want to and continue their progress in terms of learning. Our system provides 24/7 access, so they're not limited to a Monday to Friday, 8 to 4 availability. And for the team, the system provides up-to-the-minute reports and critical data for making decisions.
Absolutely. Robert, would you like to take over?
So I totally agree. There needs to be flexible systems that are responsive and provide all kinds of different information that the students can access. But I also think that I suggest that the future is beyond institutional. It's across the board, across many institutions. And because students may take different paths and they may take learning opportunities and participate in courses and programs of study with different institutions as well. So there needs to be a way for these students to collect all of this information, and either for the systems to be able to communicate with each other, which can be a challenge across institutions, of course, or for a way for students to manage that on their own so that they can input other skills, other credentials that they've picked up along the way from potentially other institutions as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Christine?
I agree with both of those sentiments and want to stress that our tech stack needs to be student-centered, because at the core of what we do, we're serving an individual. And it can be an integrated patchwork of best-of-breed systems that are all integrated, but it has to start with the learner at its heart. 10 years from now, if a student comes back to us to complete a degree or take a second certificate, they may not remember very many things, but they will remember who they are. And that's where you need to start with them.
Absolutely. That's extremely well put. I mean, personally, I'm of the mind that any transformation requires kind of two steps. And the first is cultural, and then the technology follows the culture. You can't really have significant transformation without a cultural and a philosophical shift in what drives the institution forward. But once that change takes place, then it becomes more reasonable to start looking at, well, how can we start delivering on that vision? So with that, we're coming up on the end of our time. I think we've really dove deep into this idea. Ultimately, as higher education begins to position itself to serve a 100-year life and frankly, the future of work more broadly, it's worth exploring how to integrate the concepts of the 60-year curriculum into the institutional status quo. It's my belief that in order for post-secondary institutions to do this effectively, they need to lean on their colleagues in continuing a professional education division for their strategic insights, their experience, and their vision when it comes to serving audiences that fall outside of that 18 to 22-year-old residential formative learner. With that, I'd like to sincerely thank our panelists for helping to put these ideas in context. I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the EvoLLution and Destiny Solutions for attending this webinar. Again, every idea we shared in this webinar came from EvoLLution content, and I would obviously it's a obvious opinion, but I'd encourage you to subscribe to the EvoLLution to get the ideas that we publish in your inbox. You can also feel free to reach out to me with any questions or any feedback. My email address is there, and if you email info@evollution.com, that'll come to me as well. I recognize that my personal email address has a lot of repeating letters. But with that, I'd like to thank everyone sincerely for taking the time out of their afternoons or mornings to learn a little bit more about the 60-year curriculum and the capacity to influence and impact higher education in Canada. I hope you all enjoyed it.